All right, now let's welcome Kris, Sharna, and Michael. The Zoom floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Wafang, and welcome everybody. This is wonderful to see you all here, and we have a nice turnout today for this. And this is what's going to happen is we're going to just have a conversation with Sharna and I and Kris about her book and about the interesting and often sort of truthful kind of contributions that it makes to this dialogue that we're all a part of. Sharna and I have appeared on Kris's webinar series to talk about our book, which tries to capture some truths to help people do their giving better and help people who sit at all sides of the philanthropic table to do that work. And that's what Kris does with her new book. It's sort of, we know this phrase, speaking truth to power. She speaks some real truths here that may be hard for those in power to hear, but they're really useful. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I would just let people know that we are going to, about 20 minutes to go. We're going to pause and have Q&A with the audience, with you all. We can do this we'll do this in two ways. Either put your question in the chat, and you can do that throughout the presentation or at the end when we turn to Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you, and you can unmute yourself and turn your camera on and ask your question that way. So keep your questions in mind as we go through. So Kris, we just want to start with this. The title of the book and the title of this Lunch and Learn is Delusional Altruism, which is maybe a somewhat dramatic term. So maybe say a bit about what you mean by that term and why it's a challenge for philanthropists.
Yeah. So by delusional, so the title is Delusional Altruism, and I've been advising philanthropists of all kinds for over 20 years. So ultra high net worth donors and leaders of all kinds of foundations, community, family, corporate. And one thing I've learned really is that they are genuine in their altruism, right? They want to make a difference. They want to change the world or their neighborhood, but they are delusional in the sense that they're getting in their own way. So by delusional, I don't mean crazy. I mean, clinging to misguided beliefs and practices, having blind spots, if you will, that are preventing them from achieving the impact that they're trying to have. And often they don't even realize this is happening. And so I really wrote the book to help funders recognize these delusions and how they happen, because they happen to all of us. They happen to me too. And recognize them, and then what they can do differently to have a more transformational impact on their giving, and doing that in part by transforming themselves and how they give.
So say a bit about what some of those, like this, you go through a number of these kind of misconceptions, delusions, if you will, that philanthropists have that get in their own way, which is, I think, an interesting way of thinking about it. So what are some of those specifically? Maybe give some examples of how those play out.
Yeah, there are so many, but I outlined 7 in the book. And the first, and I think the most important, is a scarcity mindset. It's really this misguided belief that, you're saving money is important, but I think funders tend to save money on the wrong things. And this is often surprising because, if funders have anything, right, they have wealth, either their own wealth or they're managing and supporting the distribution of somebody else's wealth. And but instead of having an abundance mindset, I think many funders have a scarcity mindset. And this is a belief that, by somehow maintaining a Spartan operation, that equates to delivering greater value into the communities and issues that you're serving. And this manifests itself in a lot of ways. I think one that nonprofit leaders will experience a lot is, funders that aren't really truly investing in the true costs of what it takes to run the nonprofit or achieve the impact that they're trying to have. And, there's often a myth around overhead, for example, that, overhead is bad and a nonprofit is good if 99 cents of every dollar goes to, help on programs and only 1 cent for administration or whatever. But, I think this is misguided because, if you believe in a nonprofit and they're doing great work and they're having an impact to their community, well, don't you want them to have top talent? Don't you want them to have a really great, financial management system a fabulous board of directors, the ability to evaluate themselves, a great communications plan, the ability to fundraise, et cetera, right? Because of course you do, because then they will have more impact on the community because they'll be better equipped to do that work. But too often donors will withhold money, that kind of money, because it's somehow overhead and that's bad. And I think that prevents them from getting in their way from having the impact they want. Similarly, funders can tend to put a lot of kind of restrictions and tightly control how funds are being spent, what it can be spent on and not spent on. And then subsequently, a lot of nonprofits are scrambling to, kind of piece together resources to make the program run effectively. They probably don't have enough anyway, and they're spending a colossal amount of time with all that fundraising and all that piecemealing, right? So that's wasting time and impact. And then third, too often I think funders only allocate funding in 1-year increments. And so, a challenge with that, I was interviewing a nonprofit leader for a foundation client who described the value of getting 3 years of funding from this particular foundation. But she said, what happens is when we only get 1 year of funding, we can only make 1 year decisions. We can only think 1 year out. And so what she was trying to do in a different example was a policy advocacy strategy. She was trying to change policy around a particular issue. She had the person in mind that she wanted to hire to run this initiative, but she would have had to, recruit her out of another well-paying job. And she didn't want to do that because she only could offer 1 year of support. It was a 3-year project, but the funding was only being provided in 1 year increments. And she just didn't trust that she'd have funding for year 2. So she couldn't hire the top talent she wanted. And she had to hire a, lower level person with less experience who was willing to take a 1 year gig to, get the experience, right? So consequently, the impact wasn't as strong. So that to me is a scarcity mindset, but I think it's a lack of investment in yourself as a funder, which people often find surprising. And so again, I think to have the greatest impact as a foundation leader or a donor, I think you need to become the best philanthropist you can be, really. And so that doesn't necessarily mean, taking your board to the Bahamas and staying at, the Ritz-Carlton for a retreat. What it does mean, though, is, investing time and resources in yourself and your learning, in developing trusting relationships with your nonprofit partners, investing in technology, as we've all learned the value of that. There's a lot of funders that when COVID hit had no ability to make online grant payments. And literally, they only could issue payments for nonprofits via paper checks that were locked in an office that they had no access to, and that had to be signed by multiple people, right? So because they hadn't invested a little bit of money, really, and a little bit of effort to changing their systems and improving their technology. So that's, I think a scarcity mindset. Another delusion, though, is fear. And I think that fear is such a strong problem in philanthropy that I actually devoted an entire chapter to it. And I think fear really is what drives that scarcity mindset. And so, it's fear in a lot of different ways, right? It's fear of, as a wealthy donor, coming out, if you will, as a person of wealth and being known, and the fear of how people will perceive you differently and look at you differently and ask for things that they wouldn't previously have asked for. It's a fear of coming out in support of particular causes and what kind of backlash you might get, regardless of what that cause is, if people aren't happy with your choice. But I think another way fear manifests itself, interestingly, is what I call like funders wrapping themselves up in a data blanket. So it's investing, and again, this is like saving or spending money on the wrong things, investing a tremendous amount of money and time on data collection to like kind of wrap yourself in the safety blanket of data because you're fearful of taking a stand or just saying, we're going to be focusing on this particular issue or cause, or here's our strategy. And so, I've talked to funders who were embarking on strategic planning and wanted to first start by doing a benchmark study of benchmarking themselves against other funders? Like, how do they compare to other funders in their community? Well, really, like, who cares? You know what I mean? Like, why would that help you? You're going to spend, I don't know, $50,000 in 6 months figuring that out. Like, great. You're comparing apples to oranges. You're a family foundation. That's a community foundation. Like, you have different missions. Another community foundation during COVID spent $350,000 on strategic planning. And most of that was a year of data gathering, of data collection. Now, I'm not against data. I'm not against like learning about the community, but my God, you're a community foundation. Like, you should be doing that all the time. And what happened instead was all their staff got like sucked into this, vortex of data gathering and analyzing and community convening and blah, blah, blah. It's great to engage the community. Absolutely. It's great to learn about your community, but that should be happening in an ongoing way. You shouldn't have to pause, take all of that staff resource and time for a month to come up with some kind of, assessment to justify your strategy, which probably isn't going to change that much anyway. And so those are just a couple examples. And of course I could share more.
No, that's fantastic. Thanks.
Something I want to underscore that I hear you threading throughout, Kris, is a theme that Michael and I heard often from Next Gen donors who we interviewed for our book, which is really a bias towards impact, right? I hear you talking about sort of use of funds like investing in operating support, for example, to achieve an impact, to achieve a goal. So I just want to check that with you and understand how the importance of impact really is playing into the advice that you're giving. And also if you could talk a little bit about, kind of fascinated in how you organized your book into these two sections, right? The don'ts that would get in the way of achieving impact and the do's that would help facilitate greater impact in philanthropy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do believe, generally speaking, that we should be seeking with our philanthropic dollars to achieve some kind of positive social change, call it impact, call it whatever you want. And I do believe that you want to learn if that's happening. If it's not happening, what can you do to fix that or make course corrections? If it is happening, how can you share that with others or amplify it or scale it or do more of it? But I also believe that there's a lot of value. I mean, I really, funders are approaching their work from all kinds of starting points, right? And sometimes, giving back to the community that helped them is their goal. And I really believe that when I work with my clients, I start with wherever they're at, right? And so I'm not trying to push them into impact. I'm trying to help them articulate, what are they wanting to accomplish and how best to accomplish it and what are their motivations for giving. And I also believe that there's a lot of value in trying things. I think philanthropy can be a great kind of first money in, risk-taking dollars that don't exist in other places, don't really exist in government, for example. And so sometimes you have no idea what the impact might or might not be because it's never been done before, or it's a new problem that's emerging, or it's a new solution you're testing. And so I think there's a lot of value in simply, trying things out as a funder and taking that risk, taking, kind of prudent risk and being thoughtful about what you're doing for the purpose of learning, kind of that R&D, research and development role, that we know. I mean, think of the vaccine, right? Which was developed with, remarkable speed for COVID. Well, I can only imagine how many efforts were tried and failed in the past 30 years or more, right? On the road to learning that has, and what has now become the vaccine, right? And so thank God for all those efforts that didn't work, right? And thank God someone paid for them. So, because now we have this vaccine that's,
Right.
saving.
The innovation capital or the risk capital that got us to this place.
Exactly.
Yeah, makes sense. And say a little bit more then about how you categorize these lessons into do's and don'ts. I'm assuming, given all of your experience over these years with donors, you start to understand how they think, right? And so
Yeah, I guess, my approach, and, with a book title like Delusional Altruism, it's designed to be provocative and get people thinking differently. But I really, again, because I believe that people want to do the right thing, make positive change, I really wanted to provide very practical advice as to what people can do differently. And so to me, that was a good framing of the first half of the book is all the delusions. And the second half of the book is titled Transformational Giving. And so it's really about things that you can do differently, which includes, starting with asking the right questions, kind of down to basics. Because I think one of the delusions is too often funders start with the wrong questions. For example, they ask how they should do something before clarifying what they want to do. And so consequently, people sort of spin their wheels. I think if any of us had been in planning meetings where the conversation went around in circles with no end in sight and no resolution at the end, it's probably because people didn't have clarity on the what, their objectives, what are they trying to accomplish? And only then can you think about how to do it. So so I wanted, to offer very practical advice, ranging from how to increase your speed in philanthropy, how to increase your agility, your adaptive nature, how to become innovative as a funder, a word that's tossed around a lot, but what does that actually mean? And how do you do it, right? And especially strategy. I mean, I talk a lot in the book, and I'm sure we'll talk today about the importance of clarifying your strategy quickly and then implementing it.
So I just want to pick up on that last bit. We have a number of people in the room who sit in different seats. So I'm going to ask you, I think this question, building on your idea that one of the things that donors need to do is to be more adaptable, more agile, right? Pursue more innovations, take more risks. There's this idea in the field that that's easier for individual small donors, families to do that, right? To be more nimble than it is for these big bureaucratic institutional donors, or those that have a lot of staff, or that have, they're sort of ossified in how they do their work, and that's how we've always done it. So do you see these adaptations that you're talking about that would improve giving? Are they easier for individual smaller donors to do? Do they apply to big institutional donors as well? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. It absolutely applies to all types of donors. So the largest funders in the country, corporate givers, as well as individuals and families. But I don't know that it's necessarily easier. I mean, it certainly could be easier to pivot. If you're an individual and you've made a decision, like you can act on that decision, and you don't have to ask anybody's permission, right? You just do it. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to, right? And so I talk about the scarcity mindset. There's also an abundance mindset, and that I think is part of that transformation. And I think really the answer to your question hinges more upon whether the donor, be it, the largest foundation in the country or the world, or a family, an individual, whether they have an abundance mindset, whether they are willing to take risk, whether they're willing to take a stand for something, whether they're willing just simply to clarify their strategy and begin implementing it right away. So, a large foundation with, in the US, let's set aside Gates, which is the outlier, and then, 300 people, 400 people is of the largest. Strategy is really about clarifying what you're trying to accomplish, like what kind of foundation do you want to be, what kind of impact do you want to have, where are you today, what are the top 3 most important things that foundation should focus on, and aligning all your people, systems, and processes to achieve that strategy, right? So sure, doing that with 300 people will take more effort, but if you have clarity and you are, clear on, who's accountable for what, by when, you understand your top priorities, everyone in the organization understands their role, you can swiftly move into implementation, and you can pivot and change, pretty rapidly. And a individual donor could be stuck in overwhelm for years, right? Because they feel guilty for having all that money. They grew up poor, suddenly have wealth due to an inheritance or the sale of a business or whatever, or made money and sold a business, and feel guilty and feel stuck and overwhelmed and can't make a decision. So, it could take forever for a person to to make the kind of change. So to me, it's more an abundance mindset and a willingness to, sometimes it's a willingness to get help. That's where I come in a lot of times, is helping my clients get that clarity of what they're trying to accomplish, understand their strategy, figure out what those top priorities are, and then move them into implementation so that they can begin to create change and feel that forward momentum and make course corrections along the way.
We have a colleague named Kristen Keffler who lives in Denver, Colorado, and she says something similar, that donors can feel paralyzed by predecessor, right? The outsized legacy of the person who came before them, whose shoes they're trying to fill in stewarding the foundation, or paralyzed by privilege. How come I have so much that others don't? Or paralyzed by possibility. I think there's now 1.5 million nonprofits in the US and 10 million globally. So what you're saying completely resonates with me. And I'm curious, Kris, how you counseled people, or what chapter you sent them to in the book during this last year of all these crises, right? So we have abundance, but maybe there's a lot of things going on that we could be supporting. How did you coach people to sort of set aside their delusions and move forward thoughtfully in the middle of all the pandemic, the economic crisis, racial reckoning, et cetera?
Yeah, it's funny. My book was published a week into lockdown, which I would not advise for those of you that want to write books. Don't publish a book during a global pandemic. However, I was surprised and really grateful that the content, because I didn't think this would be happening, the content turned out to be very relevant for helping funders navigate and lead during a crisis. And so I think, but what I really advise people now, or I have all year and it continues, is it can feel, as you said, Sharna, paralyzing when change feels so constant, right? I mean, it can feel like, masks, no masks. What's the latest, guidance, and how do we respond? With all the upheaval that we've had in the past year, surges and the political upheaval and polarization, disasters. I mean, we can go on and on. It can feel like, what's the point in making a plan, or because it's going to change again, right? And I really advise people that the reality is the future is no more uncertain today than it was last decade or last century, really. But don't let that thought paralyze you. Let it actually free you, because we don't have to, come up with contingencies for every possible scenario, right? I think we have to recognize that disruption and volatility are the status quo. And there is no new normal coming around the corner. Like, we can't all just sit around and wait for the new normal to arrive, because it's not arriving. It doesn't actually exist. It never did. And so I think, it's kind of that mindset shift again, sort of an abundance mindset, and a shift from, instead of the future being so uncertain, paralyzing us, let it free us. And, to me, creating a plan or a strategy, be it your strategic plan for your foundation or your nonprofit, or your, fundraising strategy or your communication strategy, whatever it is, you're planning a wedding, like whatever, you can create a plan you can count on even when conditions keep changing. And you can simply ask yourself, what are we trying to accomplish in the next year? Again, where are we today on that issue? And what are the 3 most important things we need to focus on to move us from where we are today to where we want to be? Assign people to be accountable to them, like literally, Michael, what are you responsible for? Sharna, what are you responsible for? And we're going to reconvene in 2 weeks, and you're going to share with us like what you've come up with so far, your list of next steps, the progress you've made, the challenges you've encountered. And we're going to talk about that and see what kind of progress that there is and how we can help you move forward, so that there's that immediate momentum. And you also have the confidence that you can make course corrections along the way. So again, because disruption and volatility is the status quo, like, things are going to keep changing. We don't know what the summer is going to be like. We don't know what next year is going to be like. There will be other crises and opportunities. And so I think also, periodically checking in on yourself and saying, as a team or as an individual, a family, a foundation, and saying, what progress have we made? What's changed in the world or in our community or in our organization that might warrant us to make course corrections to this plan, make them, and move on. And maybe you need new priorities and new accountabilities, but you kind of get into this forward motion. And the value to a 300 or 400 person organization or any size is that everyone is clear on where you're headed, right? And everyone knows their role. And so literally when you're sitting down at your computer or your kitchen table or your office, you know what to do and you can allocate your time accordingly. And so actually I wrote a guide last year that pulls on ideas from the book, but it might be of interest to listeners. And it's called 8 Things Every Philanthropist Can Do to Change the World, Even When the World Keeps Changing. And it's really 8 steps to doing what I just described, to creating a plan that you can count on even when things keep changing. And it's as equally relevant for a nonprofit leader or a corporate leader or a philanthropist or a funder. So if you want to download it, you actually can pull out your phone and you can text the word Plan 2021 to the number 411-321. So text the word Plan 2021 to the number 411-321, and then it's a free download, it's a free guide. And again, I wrote it to offer really practical advice as I was listening to a lot of my clients who were kind of pulling their hair out saying like, how do I even know what to do next? Because I'm not sure what I'm gonna read when I open up the news in the morning.
You're really good at the short form guides and keeping the thought leadership coming. So glad people are introduced to them here. Thanks.
Yeah. So I guess, I'm sensitive also to the fact that in the room, there are a lot of people who are from nonprofits and they're really, really interested, obviously, in the mindset of the donors that are their chief supporters and will need to be for the future. And I think there's some of the things that you're saying that sound like, wonderful news, like providing multi-year operational support instead of 1-year programmatic support grants. And, that's music to nonprofit ears. But there's also I'm sure some concerns about things like, that failing is okay, right? And taking risks can sometimes lead to things not going well, but that's okay because the donor can learn from that. Well, where does that leave the nonprofit in that process, right? And so I'm sure there's a lot of consequences here that you thought through about how these changes that are necessary in the donor world affect the nonprofits that they support and that they partner with. So maybe talk a bit about what all this means for nonprofits and what they can do to respond.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And it actually reminds me of, those magazines that you read and there's like stories that say, like celebrities, they're just like us, right? And then there's a picture of like George Clooney buying a smoothie and he's wearing sweatpants on a Saturday or something. You're supposed to relate. Well, to me, I think that's kind of the same approach that nonprofits need to take with funders, because I think too often we put our funders on this pedestal, right? And they're somehow like different than us, or not better, but inaccessible, or we don't want to upset them. You're kind of walking on eggshells. And I think really what the most important thing a nonprofit can do is change their mindset around their relationship with their donor and really think of yourself as a true peer and partner to your funder, and to recognize. And so that mindset is, when you think about it, it's how you approach the conversation. That's how you even are willing to pick up the phone and call your funder. I mean, I know a lot of nonprofits, when COVID hit, were fearful of fundraising. They were afraid they would be upsetting their donor if they called, or, the donor probably also is, dealing with COVID and lockdown. And so I might bother them. Should I call them? I'm not really a first responder organization. Maybe my needs aren't important enough. I'll just kind of wait it out, right? But that's a fear-based mindset. And I think a mindset of abundance and recognizing that you're a peer to your funders is to have the confidence that you're going to pick up the phone and talk to them and reach out. And also recognizing that funders need nonprofits in order to achieve their missions, right? So, I mean, if you're any kind of foundation, a community foundation, family foundation, corporate, if you're a donor, you might have a mission to support the vitality of your community, or you might have a mission to end homelessness in your lifetime or something. But, you're not the one, the funder generally is not the one, building low-income housing, right? Or like, running the shelters or conducting the arts education in the arts programs, right? They're funding it. And nonprofits are the vehicle with which they achieve their missions. And so also recognizing the value that you bring as the nonprofit, the funder needs you. And it's important to recognize that. And then I'd say thirdly is invest time in building relationships with your funders. So, you want to have a rapport where you can pick up the phone or send a text or an email or something with the confidence that your funder is going to want to hear, A, know who you are, and B, want to hear from you, regardless of the situation. And so you have a relationship with them that's ongoing so that you can feel comfortable to say, hey, here's the great news, things are going great, or things aren't going so great. We launched this new initiative. It's not going as planned. I wanted to update you and get your feedback and advice. And also recognize that, funders bring more than money, right? They bring, we always hear the, treasure, talent, ties, and what's the other one? Time, right? But, funders are often in a privileged position, not only financially, but of knowledge, of connections in the community, of people that they know, their knowledge of the field, their knowledge of other funders. And so I think it's a position of strength to go to a funder and say, hey, things aren't working, or I need your advice, I'm looking to expand, or whatever it is, and seeking their knowledge, their insight, their introductions they might be able to make in addition to their funding.
I really like the idea of sort of thinking about how, thinking about how how your relationship with the foundations and those leaders can be where you realize that they are a person sitting in a position who has to do their job as well, and their job is to find ways of meeting their mission, doing good in the world. I had a foundation leader one time said something to me that was very surprising. It seemed so simple, because I was talking to him about the trepidation that people have when they make asks, and how, and it's always they always get stressed about asking for money. And he said, look, think of it this way: I can't do my job if somebody doesn't ask me for money. That is literally my job. And if somebody doesn't ask, I rely on you to ask in order for me to be able to keep my job. And that's a completely different way of thinking about it, which I think is fantastic. So I want to turn to some questions. We've had some things going on, the great things going on in the chat. I'm going to go back to a question that Amanda Mizrahi asked, and there's been some respondents, but I'm going to go back to the way she asked it originally and see what you have to say. So she says, something we struggle, and she's from the Mayberg Foundation. So something we struggle with is the fuzzy space between strategic and relational giving. Our standard is to give operational gifts, which is great, but it isn't because we're being strategic, but when our trustees are feeling strategic, we end up with programmatic grants. How do we as a staff help maintain those operational gifts, but see them in a strategic framework like you were talking about? So what do you think of that?
Well, that's interesting. I think, so I define strategy as a framework within which decisions are made that influence the nature and direction of the organization. So it's a decision-making framework. And again, it might seem simple, but I don't think it is. Or maybe it is, and that's the point. But, what are you trying to accomplish? So as a foundation, what are you trying to accomplish? And I also think strategy, things are changing so rapidly that it's hard to plan out more than a year, really. You might have a 5-year goal, but what are you trying to accomplish in the next year? Where are you today? Meaning anything. It could mean we're a brand new foundation. We don't know what we're doing. Or it could mean we have this track record, but we're kind of shifting or whatever. Where are you today? And what are the things you need to focus on? Another way to think about it is, what is that 20% of effort that you think is going to drive the 80% of results? If we could only do 3 things next, what would those 3 things be, right? And that's really up to you to decide ideally it's an informed decision. And I think it's a great practice to engage the community or your grantees or the people you're trying to help in informing your strategy. But so you could, I think, make a very reasonable decision that, one of the best ways we can do that is to support the operations of these nonprofits, that what they need, they're doing great work, they're delivering great results, and what they need is operating support. What they need is general operating support. Or it could even be capital support. Like, let's say you're trying to support early childhood education, right? And the problem is there's not enough preschools, high quality preschools in certain neighborhoods that are accessible by families, and physically building new buildings when people can all go back would be really important. So I think, to me, I don't really see, I'm not entirely sure what this person means by relational, but to me, it's really what you think are the most important drivers. It could be funding research. It could be funding leaders and the pipeline of leadership. What do you think are the most important drivers to help you achieve the results you're trying to achieve with your strategy?
I'm curious, there's some conversation in the chat about Charity Navigator and GuideStar and Better Business Bureau, all those kind of online mechanisms that help organizations to assess themselves, and then the donors utilize to assess whether they're going to have an efficient or effective grant. And I'm curious, given the delusions we've been talking about today, how do you advise donors to make use or not of those mechanisms? How should they utilize them, read them, make sense of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually working with a corporate client, and this woman was new to philanthropy, but she had been in the organization, the company, for a long time. And so, her instinct was delusional and a scarcity mindset of like, the best organizations are the most efficient. So the fewest, percent of their dollars spent on overhead is better. Like, that was just her frame walking into it, and like, didn't question it, right? That was just what she thought. And so I just explained, I said, well, actually, let's think about this. What does it take to really run these nonprofits? And don't you, all the things I just said, don't you want to ensure that they have the tools, the resources, the capacity, the talent to be effective, just as this company invests in its own human resources and training and professional development and technology and innovation of product, et cetera, et cetera. So it really, and then she got it, right? And so she was like, oh, I never thought about it that way, right? And so it isn't really a hard sell, I don't think. You just need to explain it and understand that a lot of people are just walking in with certain assumptions, which is common. I sit on my grandparents started a very small foundation. And so now the third generation, the cousins, of which I am one, are responsible for allocating the funds every year. And this exact same thing happened with us last year, where my cousin, who runs a business and knows all about investing in his business and growth and innovation, had said the exact same thing. Well, this is a great organization, and they only spend 1% of their budget on administration. And he just assumed that was the right thing to do. And I said, well, what if you only spent, 1% of your revenue investing it back into the growth of your business? And, his jaw dropped. He was like, oh, well, that wouldn't be very smart, So I just think it's a willingness to have that conversation. And I think it's important for nonprofits to feel confident to say the same things, and just in a way that is educational and helping people understand. So I think those kinds of tools are all really important, and I encourage funders to use them. To me, it's a data point, right, among other data points. And so not to let that be the end all be all. There's another resource I'll share. I haven't seen the chat, so I don't know if it's been mentioned, but it's called, I think, the Full Cost Project. And it's an effort by a group of philanthropy associations in California, along with, I think, the Nonprofit Finance Fund or someone like that, to really think about helping funders understand the true costs of whatever they're trying to accomplish. So starting with the end in mind and backing into what would it actually cost to accomplish that? And we need to fund that. Not this make-believe money, budget that we've created out of nowhere. And so there are resources and funders that are increasingly trying to do that.
Yeah, I think that is nonprofit finance fund
Yep.
that's doing that with Philanthropy
Right.
California. Yeah. And we just have the link to it now. Wafang put up. Thank you. So another question that's come up in the chat from Emily, and I think this goes to this difficulty of thinking of how do we build those relationships that are not necessarily natural and not the way we've traditionally done things. Those relationships between donors and partner nonprofits. And the question is, you talked about what donors can do to navigate their delusions, and what nonprofits can do to navigate donors having those delusions. Are there opportunities you see for both groups to work together in that navigation of the delusions? Are there because I can imagine a nonprofit coming in and saying to their donor, "I'm going to help you navigate your delusion." That I read about in Kris Putnam-Walkerly's book may not go over that well, but there's got to be ways. Are there other ways that we can, seed that conversation in a way that helps both sides?
Yes, I would not advise that as your approach. Here's a book I think you might want to read. No, that would be great. So, I think honestly, we put too much on this. It's a lot more, I think as a field, we tend to complexify the simple rather than simplifying the complex. And so if you want to build a relationship with someone, like pick up your phone, call them. I mean, luckily now in the US, we can probably begin to meet in person outdoors or whatever you feel comfortable doing. It starts with a conversation, right? Hey, I thank you for funding us for the past year. Super important. I'd love to update you on what we've been doing, what we're thinking, what we've learned, and what's working, what not working so well, and ways that, you might be able to help us. Would you be willing to have lunch? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's that simple. And then you take it from there. So you're able to have an honest conversation, and you're able to, let them know ways that they could be helpful. And, and as you bump up against delusional altruism, I guess, then you continue to have that conversation. When they say, we only allocate 10% for overhead, so you have to reduce your budget or you have to do whatever, you can say, okay, we can do that, but let me just tell you, what it actually costs to run this. It actually, we've done the research, we've done our cost, analysis. It actually is more like 18%, and here's why. But we've had a great track record of our employees never leave and blah, 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 whatever. And I mean, why not say, by the way, did you know that the Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, and I forget who else, Packard and somebody else, recently announced they're actually intending to increase their overhead rates. Did you know that the Robert Wood Johnson, because they did at the end of 2019, it's in the book somewhere. Did you know that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, because this just happened a few months ago, increased their overhead rate from 12, I think, to 20%. So there are funders that are recognizing that actually it takes more. Share them within the full cost project. You know what I mean? So just why not, again, your peers, right? So you would tell your colleague that, right? Your other nonprofit executive director or your colleague about that. So why not tell your funder? You're not trying to be negative, you're trying to be helpful. And they could still say, that's fine, I don't really care. This is our policy and we're sticking to it. But you can do that, and you're bringing resources, you're bringing ideas, and you're really showing up as a powerful leader, really, I think.
I think you're reminding us, I love your phrase, your peers, right? There is an issue of power imbalance, right? We just have to acknowledge that. And in the same regard, we are all nonprofit professionals, just some sit on the allocation side and some sit on the nonprofit side. And so or the nonprofit operational side, if you want to look at it that way. Actually, someone had just put in the chat that actually rates should be set by nonprofits who know what the actual costs are, not the foundation. So appreciate that reframe. Kris, curious as we come to almost the end of our time together, do you have sort of next step, right, takeaway suggestions. If I'm leaving this lunch and learn, like, and I'm wearing a donor hat, or if I'm leaving this lunch and learn, I'm wearing a nonprofit or consultant hat, right? Like what are kind of the few next steps that you really encourage people to get started? Because I could imagine feeling like, yeah, I got a lot to work on in terms of my fears and feelings of scarcity and delusions, right? But that's like long-term life work. What are some really concrete, practical next steps that we can advise people on?
Yeah. So in general, I mean, I think, and I write about this, the very last chapter of the book is about taking action, because it can feel overwhelming. Like you might have, if you read the book, you might be like, oh my God, I have all these things to improve, right? But none of us can do like 15 things at once. You know, what are the 3, or what's the one change that you want to make? And I will also just say there's a discussion guide that goes along with the book that's a free download. The book website is delusionalaltruism.com. And that includes links to purchase it. But if you scroll down to the resources section, there's a free download of a discussion guide. And that can also be a really useful tool as you're going through this and making sense of what you're learning and some of the changes you want to make. But, you know, in general, I mean, so I'd say do the one thing that really resonates with you that, you know, you can really act on. But in general, I think it's always a great practice to clarify your goals and clarify your strategy. If it's you personally, you know, we're halfway almost through the year. What do you want to have accomplished by the end of the year? Or what are your goals for the next 12 months? What is your own strategy? And think about like, this is what I'm trying to do. If it's lose your COVID-20, or if it's, you know, get a new job, or if it is develop a communication plan, whatever, right? What are the 3 max most important things I should focus on to get that moving, to make that happen? And then the magic is again, very simple, but often overlooked, is literally pulling out your calendar. If it's a paper calendar or Outlook or whatever it is, pulling out your calendar and trying to eliminate a lot of the stuff that's already on there that's taking up so much of your time and causing you to feel busy and overwhelmed, like either getting rid of it, delegating it, or shortening it. And adding in, if it's just for now, blocks of time on your priorities and your goals so that you do make time for them. To me, it seems simple, but if we don't know where we're headed, we're not going to get there, right? And if we don't allocate time to what's most important, I mean, to be honest, my book is an example of this. When you write a book, you can self-publish it or commercially publish it. This was commercially published. I wrote it. I submitted it to a bunch of publishing houses. I was either rejected by them or no one got back to me. And so a year went by. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder why I haven't made any progress on getting this book published. And then I thought, well, duh, like I haven't been doing anything, right? So I made a plan of what I was trying to do, and I allocated time in my calendar to, you know, reaching out to acquisitions editors at various publishing houses and reaching out to them and contacting them. And 5 weeks later, I had a book contract with Wiley. So, and it's because I was intentional. I set an intention, I had a goal. But literally, I blocked time in my calendar so that every day I at least spent a half hour doing something to try to get to that goal. It seems simple, but I think it's really important. So if you don't know from the conversation or from reading the book, you know, what's most important, I think just kind of come up with your goal for the year, make a plan to implement it, and block out time in your calendar to make that happen.
Yeah, it's, you know, I think that we have time for one more question, if we can do it in a couple minutes. It follows directly from what you were just saying about this challenge that people have with time. So Mark Peterson in the chat said, as someone who runs a family foundation, I struggle with the bandwidth for meaningful relationships. Fundraisers want a relationship with me because they're told in fundraising school that you raise money through relationships, which is true. And trends in next gen giving, as Sharna and I have written about, prioritize these relationships also, but we all have our limits. Do you have ideas on how to navigate this tension of wanting to have the relationship, I guess, but not really having the bandwidth to do it all full on?
Yeah, I'd say 3 things, and I'll try to be quick here. One is literally kind of going off of what I was just saying, look at your calendar and look at how you're currently spending time, and things that are like sucking the life out of you or draining your energy or just taking longer than they need to? Like, does that hour phone call need to be an hour? Could it be done in a half hour? Does it even need to be a call? Could it be an email? So just really think about how you can get rid of stuff that is not important, that is not at your priorities. You don't like doing it. You could hire someone, get an intern, whatever, a virtual assistant to do. So that's one thing, because that'll free up time. I think secondly is, just because like building trusting relationships is what everyone talks about, that doesn't mean you have to build them with everybody, right? So also get clear on which are the nonprofits that you want to build relationships with and which aren't, and just have an honest, no conversation. Thank you so much for reaching out. I'm sure what you're doing is really important. However, we don't fund in this area. So I, due to other commitments that I have, I just can't make time. It's just honest. Again, to keep your time focused on what's most important. And then with the organizations you want to have relationships with, think about time efficient ways to do that. So it doesn't always have to be lunch that takes 2.5 hours, right? Getting there, getting back. Think about, I've been doing a lot of, both as a participant and will be doing soon, like kind of virtual small gatherings. So why not have like, I don't know, like office hours, if you will, you know what I mean? Like, why not say, hey, on every other Friday at 4, I'm going to be on Zoom, join me, to a limited group of nonprofits. Let's talk about what's going on, what you're experiencing. If one person shows up, great. If 6 people show up, great. Just manage that time. So just, I would say, think creatively about how you can build those relationships that aren't, sucking up a lot of your time in your day.
All right.
That's
Thank
great.
you very much. All right.
We'll put it back over to Huafeng. Thank you.
Yeah,
very
I
much.
know. Michael and Sharna are going to leave, and Kris will be here for another 15 minutes in the Zoom meeting. So thank you, Kris, Michael, and Sharna again. And we have Tamela from Johnson Center to inform you the future coming events and the other resources available to you. Tamela, I'll hand it over to you.
I just want to thank all of you. I was literally sitting here like cheering, and you saw some of my reactions. It was like, you're speaking my language. So I cannot wait to read the book. So if you are in a leadership role, in an executive role in your organization, and you're struggling with this priority management that we sort of ended the conversation on, I want to encourage you to take a look at our executive peer coaching group that starts on June 23rd. If you've never engaged in executive coaching, on June 3rd, we have a Meet the Coach, which happens to be me. So you can get online with me that afternoon. It is free. And you can, the Meet the Coach is free. The coaching group is not. So you can meet me on June 3rd, learn about how that coaching group works, what's involved, and we invite you to learn about that. A couple other things I want to mention. We do have a fantastic session coming up on the 7th of June, Philanthropy's Quest for Equity. So kind of looking at the history of our sector and what does it look like moving forward. And then one more thing I want to point out to you is on July 20th, we have a workshop called Everything Fundraising and the Kitchen Sink. So if you want some tips on how to think about fund development work differently, feel free to join us. Check our website. The link is in the chat box, and feel free to take a look at all of the other training opportunities that are available there. Thanks so much. And Kris, this was phenomenal.
Thanks again, Kris.
You're welcome. Thank you.